Matthew chapter 17. Starting in verse 1, after 6 days, Jesus took with him Peter and James and John his brother, and led them up a high mountain by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his face shone like the sun, and his clothes became white as light. And behold, there appeared to them Moses and Elijah talking with him. And Peter said to Jesus, Lord, it is good that we are here. If you wish, I will make 3 tents here, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. He was still speaking when, behold, a bright cloud overshadowed them, and a voice from the cloud said, This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him. When the disciples heard this, they fell on their faces and were terrified. But Jesus came and touched them, saying, Rise, and have no fear. And when they lifted up their eyes, they saw no one but Jesus only. And as they were coming down the mountain, Jesus commanded them, Tell no one the vision until the Son of Man is raised from the dead. And the disciples asked him, Then why do the scribes say that first Elijah must come? He answered, Elijah does come, and he will restore all things. But I tell you that Elijah has already come, and they did not recognize him, but did to him whatever they pleased. So also the Son of Man will certainly suffer at their hands. Then the disciples understood that he was speaking to them of John the Baptist. Nobody knows for sure what mountain it was that they went up. We will put that picture up here. Both Matthew and Mark say that it was a high mountain, and Luke says that they went up the mountain. Now, many biblical scholars believe that it was Mount Tabor, the lower one here. It's about 10 miles southwest of the Sea of Galilee, and it would have taken about 4 days for them to walk from Caesarea Philippi down to Mount Tabor. So it's not out of the question time-wise, since this was 6 days later, it's not out of the question that they could have gone up Mount Tabor. However, Mount Tabor is not a particularly high mountain. Mount Hermon, on the other hand, is a high mountain. In fact, it's the highest mountain in that entire region. And Caesarea Philippi is right at the base of that mountain. This, coupled with the fact that Luke says that they went up the mountain, would indicate that it was the one that they were already at. So I believe that these events we're going to talk about occurred up on Mount Hermon. Now, it doesn't say they went up to the top of the mountain. That would have been kind of troublesome because Mount Hermon is snow-covered all year round, sort of like our Mount Hood. But they went partway up, I'm sure. The 3 who went with Jesus were Peter, James, and John. They became known as the inner circle because those 3 were often included when others of the disciples went. And it's interesting to note that Peter and John are the only 2 disciples of the 12 who wrote books in the New Testament other than the Gospels. There were other writers in the New Testament. Of course, Paul wrote much of the New Testament. James, the half-brother of Jesus, who is different than this James, wrote one of the books. And Jude, another half-brother of Jesus, wrote one of the books. Other than that, it was Paul. And both Peter and John, in their writings in the New Testament, mention this transfiguration. Here in the 17th chapter of Matthew's Gospel, he says, And he was transfigured before them, and his face shone like the sun, and his clothes became white as light. The word transfigured is a form of metamorphao. Now that sounds kind of like our English word metamorphosis. In fact, that's where we get that English word. It means to change completely, like the caterpillar that changes completely into a beautiful butterfly. That's called complete metamorphosis. So this word is based on the Greek noun morphe, which refers to the inner being of a person, the essence of who they are. There's a similar word in Greek, which is schema. And any of you who have ever worked with a schematic diagram, that comes from this word schema. It refers to the outward characteristics of something. In terms of a person, it may be something like their clothes or their hair or the words they use or even actions that they perform. If you've watched very many movies and seen Tom Cruise, if you see him walking, you know that it's nobody but Tom Cruise. He's got a very distinct walk. That would be his schema. When Jesus was transformed, it wasn't just his outer appearance, his schema. It was his inner essence, his morphe. And for these brief moments, Jesus' humanity was hidden by his divine essence, the light. Now, understanding the difference in these two words also helps us understand other scriptures, specifically Romans 12:2, which says, "Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind." Or the word conformed here is the word schema. It means the outward appearance. So it says, don't be conformed to the outward appearance and things of the world. But it says, be transformed. That's the word morphe. We're to be changed on the inside. Our character is to become more like Jesus. Now, in Jesus' transfiguration, his earthly body was transformed into his heavenly form. Matthew says that his face shone. Luke simply says the appearance of his face was altered. And all three accounts say that his clothes were changed. Words like became white like light, became radiant, intensely white, became dazzlingly white. You get the impression that they thought his clothes turned white. Now, I believe that the brightness of Jesus and his clothing was a result of the Shekinah glory of God. You may have heard that term before. Shekinah comes from the Hebrew word Shekinah, which means someone who dwells or a dwelling place. A prominent Jewish rabbi says that Shekinah glory is God dwelling where he dwells. And it's throughout the Old Testament, although the word does not appear in the Old Testament, his Shekinah glory is displayed often. It's referred to as his glory, and it's frequently accompanied by clouds or smoke. A couple of examples. As the children of Israel were leaving Egypt, it says this, "And the Lord went before them by day in a pillar of cloud to lead them along the way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, that they might travel by day and by night. The pillar of cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night did not depart from before the people." So God himself went before the Israelites for 40 years through the wilderness. And when it settled down, they stopped, and when it rose up and went before them, they followed. When they got to Mount Sinai, where God gave the law, it says, "The glory of Yahweh dwelt on Mount Sinai, and the cloud covered it 6 days. And on the 7th day, he called Moses out of the midst of the cloud. Now the appearance of the glory of Yahweh was like a devouring fire on the top of the mountain in the sight of the people of Israel." So when they stood at the foot and they saw this cloud and this brightness, that was the glory of God. And the third example here comes from, again, when Solomon dedicated the temple, the first temple. As soon as Solomon finished his prayer, fire came down from heaven and consumed the burnt offering and the sacrifices. And the glory of Yahweh filled the temple. And the priests could not enter the house of Yahweh because the glory of Yahweh filled Yahweh's house. Meanwhile, back at Mount Hermon, apparently when they got there, Jesus began to pray to the Father, and the disciples took a nap. We know this because Luke says, "Now Peter and those who were with him were heavy with sleep. But when they became fully awake, they saw his glory and the two men who stood with him." Now, we don't know how they knew that this was Moses and Elijah, but all three of the gospel writers who mention this event refer to them as Moses and Elijah. And they don't say there were two people like Moses and Elijah. They all say Moses and Elijah were there with him. So as Moses and Elijah were about to walk away, Peter suddenly stands up, good old impetuous Peter, and he says, "Lord, it's good that we are here. If you wish, I'll make 3 tents here, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." Now, nobody knows for sure why he made those comments. I've looked through numerous commentaries, and I have not found a single one who can explain why did Peter say that. Now, perhaps, being impetuous like he was, he felt like he had to say something, and maybe the Feast of Tabernacles was nearby, and he thought maybe they could celebrate it there. But the point is that he just blurted something out. And as soon as he said that, it says he was immediately silenced by a bright cloud. Can you say Shekinah glory? And a voice out of the cloud from God the Father saying, "This is my beloved Son with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him." Remember those words. Listen to him. Now, this terrified them so greatly that they fell to the ground again. And then upon being comforted and raised by Jesus, they saw him in his humanity again. The glory was gone. So were Moses and Elijah. So then as they were going down the mountain, Jesus said, "Don't tell this to anybody at all until after I've been raised from the dead." I think the reason for that was he didn't want to cause any more confusion and panic among the people, because they were already wanting to make him their king, remember? And he wanted to avoid that. He knew what he had coming. Verse 14. "And when he came to the crowd, a man came up to him and, kneeling before him, said, 'Lord, have mercy on my son, for he's an epileptic, and he suffers terribly. For often he falls into the fire and often into the water. And I brought him to your disciples, and they could not heal him.' And Jesus answered, 'O faithless and twisted generation, how long am I to be with you? How long am I to bear with you? Bring him here to me.' And Jesus rebuked the demon, and it came out of him, and the boy was healed instantly. Then the disciples came to Jesus privately and said, 'Why could we not cast it out?' He said to them, 'Because of your little faith. For truly I say to you, if you have faith like a grain of mustard seed, you will say to this mountain, move from here to there, and it will move, and nothing will be impossible for you.'" Now this next phrase, "but this kind never comes out except by prayer and fasting," is not in the best Greek manuscripts. Most biblical scholars believe it was copied from Mark's account of this event. But he told them, "It's because of your little faith." Remember how many times already he's called them little faiths? Their faith seems to go up and down and up and down and up. And I know that feeling personally. Now, on coming down from the mountain, they met this crowd of people, and the crowd was arguing with the scribes. And while Jesus asked what was going on, that's when the man came and knelt before him. Now, he'd brought his son to his disciples, and they were not able to heal him. The son was possessed by a demon, which resulted in him being an epileptic, him being mute, him grinding his teeth, foaming at the mouth, being thrown on the ground, and having convulsions. This poor guy was sick, and he needed help. Now, if you remember back in Matthew 10, the disciples were given the command to go out, and they were told to heal the sick, to cast out demons, and they were able to do that. But this time they couldn't. And he told them it was due to their little faith. And we'll talk about that in a moment, but they had the faith before. I wonder what happened. Verse 22. As they were gathering in Galilee, Christina, you want to put the other picture up there? You see Galilee, the purple shaded section there, the upper one? As they were gathering in Galilee, Jesus said to them, "The Son of Man is about to be delivered into the hands of men, and they will kill him, and he will be raised on the third day." Well, after coming down the mountain and healing this little boy, Jesus and disciples headed back to Galilee. Now, apparently, they took this opportunity to go visit family and friends, because the section we just read said, as they were gathering in Galilee, which implied that they separated for a while. Now, that wouldn't be unusual because most of them lived in the area of Galilee. Jesus made this announcement and told them that he was going to be taken prisoner and that he was going to suffer. He had said from that time Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes and be killed and on the third day be raised. And remember when he told them that, what did Peter do? He said, "Lord, that's not going to happen to you. You don't have to go and suffer." And what did Christ say to him? "Get thee behind me, Satan." That you're not considering spiritual things. You're looking at things from a human perspective. This time, it says the disciples were greatly distressed. And Mark adds that they did not understand what he meant. They were afraid to ask. Verse 24. When they came to Capernaum, the collector of the 2 drachma tax went up to Peter and said, "Does your teacher not pay the tax?" He said, "Yes." And when he came into the house, Jesus spoke to him first, saying, "What do you think, Simon? From whom do kings of the earth take toll or tax? From their sons or from others?" And when he said, "From others," Jesus said to him, "Then the sons are free. However, not to give offense to them, go to the sea and cast a hook and take the first fish that comes up, and when you open its mouth, you will find a shekel. Take that and give it to them for me and for yourself." Now, I find it interesting that Matthew, the former tax collector, is the only one that tells us about this event. But this is not a civil tax like Matthew is collecting. This is a religious tax that was used for the upkeep and the service of the temple. And it was required by every male Jew 20 years and up. And it came from an event in the Exodus. Back in Exodus chapter 30, it says this: "When you take the census of the people of Israel, then each shall give a ransom for his life to Yahweh when you number them, that there be no plague among them when you number them. From each one who is numbered in the census shall give this, half a shekel, according to the shekel of the sanctuary." The shekel is 20 gerahs. Half a shekel is an offering to Yahweh. Everyone who is numbered in the census from 20 years old and upward will give the Lord's offering. And apparently, neither Peter nor Jesus had paid their temple tax yet that year. Since they were both residents of Capernaum, they were both obligated to pay this tax. And we can assume that there was no money left in the purse, because Jesus would have probably just paid it from there, but instead he told Peter what to do. When Peter came into the house, and it was probably his own house, Jesus already knew what he was about to say and spoke up. Now, he pointed out that when kings collect taxes, they don't collect it from the children. But this was not a civil tax. This was a religious tax for the temple. And who is the king of the temple? God. And who is the Son of God? Jesus. So rightly, Jesus should not have had to pay this tax. But he didn't want to make an issue out of this. He probably didn't want to give the Pharisees another reason to accuse him of breaking the law. So he gave Peter these instructions on what to do. But consider this. Peter was not a pole fisherman. He was a net fisherman. And yet he had to use a pole this time. And consider this. When a fish takes something into its mouth, it immediately determines whether it's food or not. And if it's not food, it immediately spits it out. And it does this by sucking water in through its mouth and out its gills. Well, if it were able to get a coin in its mouth, it would realize right away that it wasn't food and it would spit it out. But if it did have a coin in its mouth, it would not be able to take the bait and hook into its mouth. So the coin wasn't in its mouth when Peter first caught the fish. So this clearly was a miracle that Jesus performed while Peter was fishing. And even though Matthew is the only one that mentions this, he mentions the discussion that Jesus had about it, but he says nothing about Peter actually doing this. You notice that? He doesn't say, and then Peter went out and cast his, etc. Jesus just said, go do this. So we have to assume that he obeyed. Well, so what? This transfiguration of Jesus would have been an astounding sight if it had occurred in broad daylight in the middle of the day, but it would have been even more astounding if it occurred early in the evening or maybe even at nighttime. In fact, I think that may be the case. Notice what Luke says in his description of this event. He says, now Peter and those who were with him were heavy with sleep. But when they became fully awake, they saw his glory and the two men who stood with him. So it's possible that this occurred after dark. And that would have made this brightness even that much more spectacular. And as Luke describes the healing of the boy afterwards, he says, on the next day, when they had come down from the mountain, in fact, literal translation, and it came to pass on the next day, they, having come down from the mountain. So the implication is that they came down from the mountain the next day, which means they spent the night on the mountain. So it's very likely that these events happened during the night. Now, I want us all to see the light here. Light is part of God's essence. And here are a few verses that talk about it. 1 John 1:5, this is the message we have heard from him and proclaim to you, that God is light, and in him is no darkness at all. And this is the judgment. The light has come into the world, and people love the darkness rather than the light because their works were evil. For everyone who does wicked things hates the light and does not come to the light, lest his work should be exposed. But whoever does what is true comes to the light, so that it may be clearly seen that his works have been carried out in God. And then Paul says in 2 Corinthians, and even if our gospel is veiled, it is veiled only to those who are perishing. In their case, the God of this world has blinded the minds of the unbelievers to keep them from seeing the light of the gospel, of the glory of Christ, who is the image of God. And then finally, in a description of the New Jerusalem, which is coming down out of heaven from God, after God's created the new heavens and the new earth, John described it this way, and the city has no need of sun or moon to shine on it, for the glory of God gives it light, and its lamp is the Lamb. By its light will the nations walk, and the kings of the earth will bring their glory into it. God is light. That's what he is. That's what Jesus had to hide when he took on his earthly form. Now I want you to close your eyes for just a minute. And I want you to do some sanctified imagining here. Imagine that you're on the mountain with Jesus. You're very tired from the hike up the mountain, and it's very late in the day, so you lie down and decide to close your eyes just for a moment. Suddenly, you're roused from your nap by the presence of a bright light, and you awake to see Jesus radiating this light. Then a bright, luminous cloud comes over you, which frightens you. As you fall back to the ground and cover your head in fear, you hear the very voice of God the Father proclaiming, "This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him." Then you feel the hand of God touch you. And what are the very next words you hear? Remember, God the Father said, "Listen to him." Those words are, "Rise up and do not be afraid." Okay, you can open your eyes now. But if you read through the Old Testament carefully, you will see the expression "rise up" over and over again. It's an expression that describes preparation for battle. God the Father has just commanded you to listen to Jesus, and Jesus is saying to you, "Rise up and do not be afraid." Are we going to listen to Jesus? Are we going to rise up and follow him, or are we just going to keep on napping through life? Next, we need to understand our commission. In Matthew chapter 10, Jesus had commissioned his disciples to proclaim the coming of the kingdom of heaven. He also gifted them with the ability to perform various miracles. Here's what it says in Matthew 10. These 12 Jesus sent out, instructing them, "Go nowhere among the Gentiles and enter no town of the Samaritans, but go rather to the lost sheep of the house of Israel, and proclaim as you go, saying, 'The kingdom of heaven is at hand.' Heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse lepers, cast out demons. You received without paying, give without pay." Now, since that time in our story here, it's perhaps been a year or year and a half. And for the week after their commissioning, they did heal and cast out demons. However, since that time, there is very little evidence in Scripture that they did any more healing. And in fact, when it came to this young boy, they couldn't do it. Christ said it was because their faith was weak. Perhaps because they hadn't used their gifts, their faith had grown weaker. How long has it been since you've used the gifts that God's given you? Then let me ask you another question. Does God call smart, talented people or willing people? Listen to what Paul told the Corinthians. "For consider your calling, brothers, that not many of you were wise according to worldly standards, not many were powerful, not many were of noble birth, but God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong. God chose what is low and despised in the world, even things that are not, to bring to nothing things that are." If we are to listen to what Jesus said to the 3 disciples in the Mount of Transfiguration, then we should rise up, prepare for battle, and not be afraid. We should get in the battle for his kingdom, and we should use the gifts he's given us, no matter how weak they might be. We're commanded to use them to build up the church. Well, now what? Like the disciples, we have a commission, and we are commanded to do certain things. How many commands are there in the Great Commission? What are those commands? Well, some would say, go into all the world, preach the gospel, baptize in my name, make disciples. Those aren't all commands. There are only 2 commands in the Great Commission. In Matthew 28:19, we're commanded to make disciples. And in Mark 16, we're commanded to preach the gospel. That's our commission. That's what God told us we need to be doing in this world. Making disciples and preaching the gospel. Are you doing either one of these? I can already hear you saying, but I'm not the kind of person that God wants to use. I know my past. I know what I've done, and it's not very nice. Well, I need to tell you, I know my own past. And I know what I've done, and some of it is not very nice. And I can assure you that God is not looking for polished gemstones. He's looking for willing building blocks. But you say, I don't have any talents that he can use. If you're a Christian, then God has already gifted you to serve him, if you're willing. But I'm afraid I'll fail. Well, are you willing to try, even if you fail? Are you willing to make a fool of yourself for God's sake? When we first started this little church, I had to ask myself several times, am I willing to make a fool of myself in order to serve God? But, hey, no more buts. God says, rise up and don't be afraid. What are you going to do?